if a weapon was used. So 77.5% of the time a weapon wasn't used. Now that doesn't mean that it didn't turn violent. It just means that if it did turn violent, they didn't use a weapon in that situation. Only 18.3% of the time they did use a weapon. Well, I kind of found that interesting. What made it more interesting is the fact that they were just as likely to use a knife as they were a gun, because that's not what we understand when we listen to the national media. 8% of the time, they're just grabbing whatever's at hand. So, again, it's just bringing things into perspective, things to think about when you approach this. So risk factors. So what I wanted to kind of do was I broke this up into two. You have your internal risk factors and you have your external risk factors, and their behaviors, their attitudes, and their conduct, right? Anything else you could think of it would fit under one of those categories, wouldn't it? Your external risk factors then are all over the board, because here's where the strangers come into play. Here's your clients and your customers and your patients possibly, and your people that might come in that are meaning to do harm to you, which would be the people that are looking to either steal or whatever it might be. But the ones that I struggled with were kind of like former employees, because still kind of internal, but they're really external, because they're at that point, they might have more intimate knowledge of your organization, but they're still outside of your organization. And the other one is those employees' personal relationships that we know can bleed off into your workplace, but again, that's something else that you kind of have to consider. Still, it's external, even though it's related to the business, it's still more external. I looked at the aggression cycle, and so this is where I kind of started looking at, and this is where you're going to start looking at some things that maybe more, that most of the time people are pretty even-keeled. Life's grand, we're moving, we're going along at a particular pace, and everything's going fairly well. We're all under a little bit of stress, but we all focus, we're doing fine, okay? But then we have those causal factors happen. And there's a lot of things out there that can be considered part of those causal factors. All right, and so that's where the pressure cooker starts, right? Now all of a sudden, they're under pressure, and sometimes things keep getting added to that pressure cooker, and it keeps pressurizing and pressurizing and pressurizing until the point that if we don't do anything, we end up with some kind of a triggering event. Now that triggering event, though, can be any number of things, and the crazy thing about it is that when somebody is under a great deal of pressure, and they're not focused in on it, they're not looking at the big picture, they're really down to the details now. Because that's what pressure does, is it really it affects you in such a way that every single little tiny thing that happened in life start to affect you in a much more grand way, okay? So when those things happen, you end up with that little finite area. So when the triggering event happens, the rest of us would, out of everything that you lost control over, that's what caused you to go over the edge. And of course, then they get into the escalation. If you can't stop the escalation, gets into the crisis mode. Once you come down out of the crisis mode, then you're into recovery. So the things that you can do as an organization is start to hit these things that we can do right off the get-go. And one of that is to understand that we do have causal factors out there, and that there are things that happen with people that we can see a difference where somebody comes in, and somebody was talking about this yesterday. The guy came into work, and immediately we could tell something wasn't right with him that particular day. And so they started talking to him and saying, okay, what's going on? What's happening here? Because we feel like something's going on. And he didn't end up blowing up at work, but he ended up committing suicide in front of his girlfriend. All of those causal factors. So they did good on the recognition, but once they got the recognition, then you have to really get involved with that prevention part of it to understand, once you identify what's going on, what steps can you take to eliminate those causal factors, or to kind of bring those more into perspective and help those people work through those processes. Once the triggering event happens, you're just kind of, that's it. You can't really control those triggering events because those are hard to recognize. But you can tell when they click. You can see when it was pulled. Now all of a sudden you get into the escalation. On a personal note, Now this is where you have some de-escalation techniques that you can train your people on how to use different things to try and bring this process down, to try and eliminate some of that, explosiveness, that they can find some ways to kind of bring things back into control. And they do have some controls. Until that point, if that doesn't work, then you go into that crisis mode, and crisis mode can be almost anything, but that's the one that we see most often, where the shooter and those kind of things. So you understand that this only lasts for about 15, 20 minutes in most cases. So in that situation, you kind of have to, you're basically enduring the crisis. So there are some steps you can take in that, but you're basically just trying to protect yourself. And then once that's over with, now you're going into the recovery mode, and that's how the company is going to cope with the aftermath of whatever happened. Now, in general terms, if it was a minor event, that's not going to be hard to get, that you can deal with that fairly easy. But if this was a major event, you're probably going to have a harder time adjusting or getting back to where you originally were. So what are those causal factors? This isn't necessarily in the order that I put it up here, but I did want to bring up this denial, because this is an organizational thing. And I got this comment in one of my evaluations yesterday. When we were talking about perceptions, they said, well, there's nothing you can do. It's perceptions, and so that's how we deal, You can't meet everyone, you can't fix everyone's perception. And so it goes into that denial that we talk about. And so a company may get into situations like, it's just a minor problem. There's not much we can do with this. We're not going to address minor problems. Or it might get into, what's going to happen eventually? We can't stop it from happening. All we can do is write it out. So there's nothing we can really do prevention-wise. And that was kind of where that comment came yesterday when we were talking, when in the discussions we had, but then in the comment was, well, if we're trying to deal with people's perceptions, we can't control that. No, but you can recognize that someone's having problems with their perceptions, and you can work with them. And if you get to know your employees, and you're working with them and talking with them, you're going to be able to recognize when they're struggling with things, and that's where you can have some input to help them out. And you also, when we talk about reporting and things like that, there are things that you can do as an organization. So if you throw up your hands and you say, there's nothing we can do, then you're really struggling then, because you need to be able to understand that there's a lot of things that you can do prevention-wise to prevent these kind of things from happening, okay? And of course, the last one down there is the social problem. It's just something that we deal with in society, and there's nothing we can do to fix it. Again, these are all denial things that, as an organization, we need to combat to a certain extent, because you will see management will throw up their hands from time to time, because anything that's worth doing is kind of difficult from time to time. And when you're dealing with people, this is the more difficult end of things, because this is their perceptions, this is their beings, this involves traits, this involves all the icky stuff that we wish that we didn't have to deal with, right? If we could have businesses and make lots of money and we didn't have to have employees, we'd all be happier. But the thing is that we have to have employees, and we have to have those things. So it's important to understand that this is a resource, and we got to constantly be involved with folks, okay?